What if the Corvette you know today was almost a completely different car? Not just a different engine, but a different identity, a different purpose, even a different future. Chevrolet repeatedly asked questions that could have changed America's sports car forever. What if Corvette had a roof that looked like an aircraft? What if it carried an entire family instead of just one passenger? What if Italy redesigned it? What if racing became its entire personality? And what if Chevrolet simply dropped a gigantic V12 under the hood? These weren't fantasy drawings. They were real experiments, real cars, and real alternate futures. Some were too expensive, some were too strange, some were simply too extreme. But every one of them reveals something fascinating about Chevrolet's search for Corvette's identity. To understand these forgotten cars, you first have to understand how uncertain Corvette's future really was. When the Corvette appeared, it looked beautiful, but beauty alone couldn't guarantee survival. Chevrolet needed buyers to believe this new American sports car was more than decoration. Was it a stylish roadster, a performance machine, or a technological showcase? Nobody inside Chevrolet had a guaranteed answer, and that uncertainty created opportunity. Designers could experiment because Corvette's identity hadn't hardened yet. And one of the earliest experiments looked like it came from another decade. Meet the Corvette Corv, an early experiment that pushed the Corvette toward a completely different shape. Imagine taking the familiar Corvette Roadster and stretching its body backward into a sleek fastback. Suddenly, this wasn't simply an American roadster anymore. The roof changed everything about the car's personality. Instead of stopping behind the seats, the body flowed backward like a jet-age aircraft. From certain angles, it looked almost European. From others, almost futuristic. And that was exactly what Chevrolet wanted people to think about. What if Corvette became more sophisticated, more aerodynamic, more enclosed? The Corv became a question on wheels, displayed for Americans imagining tomorrow. But Chevrolet never turned the idea into a production Corvette. The original car eventually disappeared, but the idea survived in Corvette's design experiments. And then Chevrolet asked an even more dangerous question. What if the Corvette didn't have to remain a two-seat sports car? Today, that sounds almost impossible, because two seats became part of Corvette's DNA. But in the 1950s, that identity was still being written. That uncertainty produced one of the strangest ideas ever associated with the Corvette. The Corvette Impala concept imagined something almost contradictory. Corvette excitement with room for more people. Inside General Motors, the car was known as XP 101. The front still carried the Corvette's visual DNA, but then your eyes moved backward and everything changed. The roof stretched over a larger passenger compartment, turning a sports car into something closer to luxury. It wasn't just a pretty display piece, either. Contemporary reports associated the concept with a 225 horsepower V8. For 1956, that gave the idea some serious performance credibility. But Chevrolet ultimately chose another path. Corvette stayed a two-seat sports car, while Impala became its own full-size Chevrolet icon. Looking backward, that decision seems obvious. At the time, it wasn't. Chevrolet still didn't know what Corvette would become. And while some designers imagined comfort, others wanted something far more aggressive. They wanted the Corvette to race. That ambition brings us to Harley Earl and the Corvette SR2. Harley Earl was one of General Motors' most influential designers. He played a major role in creating the Corvette itself. But his son Jerry had racing on his mind. The story goes that Jerry wanted to race a Ferrari for Chevrolet. Imagine that pressure inside the family of the man behind America's new sports car. Harley's answer was distinctly American. Build a Corvette that could fight back. That answer became the Corvette SR2. The SR2 looked like the Corvette had stopped caring about comfort. Every detail seemed designed to make the car more serious. It received specialized bodywork and a racing-oriented windshield. Side exhaust added even more attitude. But the most unforgettable feature was the tall fin behind the driver. It made the little Corvette look like a dedicated road racer. This wasn't a car meant to sit outside a restaurant and look pretty. It looked like it wanted to attack the track. Chevrolet was beginning to learn that racing could transform Corvette's reputation. Winning on Sunday could make people believe in Corvette on Monday. The SR2 helped push Corvette toward a performance identity we recognize today. The Corvette wasn't simply becoming faster. It was developing a personality. Beautiful and intimidating could now exist in the same machine. And that lesson would soon reshape Corvette design itself. By the late 1950s, Chevrolet's design language was getting sharper. Small block V8 power was becoming part of the story, and a new design leader was ready to push the Corvette further. His name was Bill Mitchell. If Harley Earl gave Corvette its first breath, Mitchell wanted to give it sharper teeth. One of his strangest experiments became the XP700. The XP700 began with Corvette bones, but ended up looking almost unreal. The nose became longer, lower, and more exotic. The front opening looked wider and more dramatic. The sides gained dramatic vents, and the exhaust moved outward. Even the wheels carried a racing-inspired attitude. But the roof was where the experiment became truly bizarre. Later, the XP700 received a clear double-bubble canopy. It looked less like a Chevrolet and more like a jet aircraft. But Chevrolet wasn't building a science fiction prop. The transparent roof had practical goals. It was designed to reduce glare, manage heat, and improve visibility. Ventilation was incorporated into the center spine, and a periscope-style rear-view system added another futuristic touch. The XP700 was essentially a rolling laboratory. It asked questions production cars couldn't safely answer. What should a sports car roof look like? How much visibility could a driver gain? How much heat could a futuristic cockpit control? These experiments mattered because Corvette was still searching for tomorrow. And then Chevrolet explored an entirely different future by looking overseas. Imagine taking an American icon and handing its shape to Italy. In 1963, the Corvette already had a powerful new identity. The second-generation Stingray was low, sharp, and unmistakably American. Its famous split-window coupe looked unlike anything else on American roads. But Chevrolet wanted to know what happened when Italy dressed the Corvette. The answer was the Corvette Rondine. Chevrolet commissioned the project, and Pininfarina shaped the body. The designer associated with it was Tom Jarda, an American working in Turin. Instead of making the Corvette more aggressive, they made it more elegant. The body stretched into longer, cleaner proportions. The curves became smoother. The chrome became more delicate. Suddenly, the Corvette felt less like a muscle car and more like a grand tourer. The production Stingray seemed to say, "Let's go fast." The Rondine seemed to say, "Let's drive across Europe." And that difference represented a completely different future for Corvette. What if Chevrolet had chosen sophistication over aggression? What if Corvette became America's answer to European grand tourers? The Rondine offered a glimpse of that alternate history, but it remained a one-off. Corvette stayed American in attitude, and over the next decade, that attitude became much more extreme. By 1971, Corvette already had some brutally powerful options, but one version took the factory performance formula almost as far as possible: the ZR2. This wasn't built for someone who simply wanted a beautiful weekend cruiser. It was built for someone who wanted the hardest Corvette Chevrolet could offer. At its center was the LS6 454 big block V8. Chevrolet rated it at 425 horsepower. Behind it sat the legendary M22 4-speed, better known as a rock crusher. Add heavy-duty suspension, brakes, cooling, and performance gearing. The result was no longer just a sports car with a big engine. It became a weapon. A properly driven example could reach 60 in roughly 5.3 seconds. The quarter mile could arrive in around 13.8 seconds. Those numbers were serious in the early 1970s, but the timing made the car even more remarkable. Emissions rules, insurance costs, and changing fuel standards were closing in. The ZR2 felt almost like a final statement from an older performance era. And then comes a number that makes this Corvette truly astonishing. Chevrolet built only 12 ZR2 Corvettes in 1971. 12. Not 12,000, not 1,200. 12. That's the kind of production number that turns a factory car into legend. And it proves something important about Corvette history. The rarest Corvette isn't always the strangest looking one. Sometimes it's the one where Chevrolet simply went too far. Because eventually, someone asked a question every sports car owner understands. What happens when you need more seats? By the late 1970s, Corvette was an American institution. But being an institution didn't make it practical. 2 seats were still 2 seats. Families grew, kids arrived, life changed. For most owners, that meant buying another car. But California Custom Coach had another idea. Why not make the Corvette itself practical? The result was the Corvette America. And yes, it looks exactly as shocking as it sounds. The front still looked unmistakably Corvette. The long hood, low nose, and pop-up headlights were still there. But then the body kept going and going. Rear doors have been added, creating space for passengers behind the driver. Suddenly, a 2-seat sports car had become a family car. Today, 4-door performance cars barely seem strange. Around 1980, the idea was almost unthinkable. But practicality wasn't the only problem. A normal Corvette already cost serious money. The Corvette America was reportedly around $35,000. That put it in a completely different financial universe. Chevrolet reportedly considered limited production, but the numbers didn't make enough sense. And perhaps that was a real problem. People wanted more room, but they didn't necessarily want a different Corvette. The experiment disappeared, leaving behind one of Corvette's strangest alternate futures. And then the Corvette faced a completely different challenge. This time, it didn't need more seats. It needed more attitude. The early 1990s were changing the American performance car battlefield. Corvette had regained serious credibility with the ZR1. Chevrolet had shown it could challenge world-class sports cars. Then Dodge arrived with something loud, crude, and dangerous. The Viper. It carried a massive V10 and an attitude that needed no explanation. It didn't feel polite. It felt dangerous. And suddenly, Corvette risked looking almost civilized. So Chevrolet answered with one of its wildest experiments ever. They built a V12 Corvette. The car became known as a ZR12 or Falconer Corvette. From a distance, it could pass for a normal C4 ZR1, but opening the hood changed the entire story. Underneath was a gigantic all-aluminum Falconer V12. This wasn't a slightly larger Corvette engine. This was an entirely different level of mechanical ambition. The engine was associated with racing, marine, and aviation applications, and it displaced around 600 cubic inches. Output was reported around 683 to 686 horsepower. Torque was roughly 680 pound-feet. Remember, the early Viper had around 400 horsepower. This Corvette was approaching 700. But fitting that engine into a C4 was anything but simple. The V12 was simply too long for the standard Corvette nose. So the front of the car had to be stretched by roughly 8 inches. Think about that for a second. Chevrolet didn't simply find a bigger engine and drop it into the car. The car itself had to change to accommodate the engine. That gave the ZR12 slightly different proportions before it even moved. Then Chevrolet tested what all that engineering could actually do. And the numbers were brutally serious. Motor Trend recorded a quarter mile in about 11.6 seconds. The trap speed reached roughly 133 miles per hour. In the early 1990s, that was serious supercar territory. Yet the ZR12 never became the new standard Corvette. It remained an extraordinary exception. And that raises the bigger question behind all these cars. Why did Chevrolet keep building these crazy Corvettes if most never reach customers? Because production cars have rules. Experimental cars have questions. A production Corvette has to make financial sense. It has to satisfy regulations and survive real-world customers. It has to be reliable enough to leave a dealership and keep running. And it has to sell enough copies to justify the investment. Experimental Corvettes don't have to obey all those rules. They only have to answer question. What if the roof looked like this? What if Corvette had 4 doors? What if it became a Grand Tourer? What if it became a dedicated race car? What if Chevrolet installed the biggest engine it could find? What if Corvette could challenge Ferrari? What if it could scare the Viper? Those questions created a parallel history of Corvette. There's the Corvette everybody knows. And then there's a Corvette that almost existed. That's what makes these machines more important than their production numbers suggest. The Corv represents a Corvette searching for another body style. The Impala concept represents a Corvette searching for more space. The SR2 represents the moment racing started changing Corvette's personality. The XP700 represents a designer asking what the future could look like. The Rondine represents the road not taken toward Italian grand touring. The ZR2 represents Chevrolet taking performance almost to the edge. The Corvette America represents the dream of practical Corvette ownership. And the ZR12 represents the most outrageous answer of them all. Nearly 700 horsepower in a Corvette that barely had room for its engine. Look at those 8 experiments together and a pattern appears. Corvette never really became one single thing. It kept changing because Chevrolet kept testing the boundaries. Roadster, coupe, race car, grand tourer, muscle machine, 4-door curiosity, technological showcase, V12 monster. Most never became mainstream, but they didn't need to. Each one helped Chevrolet understand what people wanted from Corvette. And sometimes, learning what people don't want is just as valuable. The 4-door experiment showed that practicality alone couldn't redefine Corvette. The Rondine showed that elegance worked, but Corvette's personality was heading elsewhere. Racing proved that performance could become part of Corvette's DNA. Corvette engines progressing from small block V8 to big block to giant V12. And futuristic concepts proved Corvette could evolve without completely losing its identity. That's the strange beauty of automotive history. We look backward and assume everything was inevitable. We see today's Corvette and imagine Chevrolet always knew exactly what it would become. But that's not how history works. At the beginning, nobody knew. Designers were guessing. Engineers were experimenting. Executives were weighing risks. Customers were deciding whether they even wanted the car. And inside that uncertainty were these strange machines. Cars that were too expensive. Cars that were too radical. Cars that were too impractical. Cars that were too powerful. And cars simply too far ahead of what Chevrolet believed buyers would accept. That's why this isn't really a story about 8 obscure Corvettes. It's a story about 8 different futures Corvette could have had. Imagine if the Fastback idea had become the standard Corvette shape. Imagine if Corvette had evolved into a 4-seat grand tourer. Imagine an entire Corvette lineage built around Italian elegance. Imagine every Corvette being a stripped-down racing machine. Imagine a production Corvette with a V12. The car in that imaginary world would still be called Corvette, but it could look almost completely different from what we know. And that's what people often miss when they look at automotive history. The forgotten cars could be more revealing than the famous ones. Famous cars tell you what happened. Weird cars tell you what could have happened. And to understand Corvette, you really need both stories. Because behind every production model is a collection of ideas that didn't make it. Some were rejected. Some were too expensive. Some were too impractical. And some were simply beaten by timing. But everyone tells us something about the people defining America's sports car. That's why these forgotten Corvettes remain fascinating decades later. They remind us that Corvette wasn't born with a finished identity. It earned that identity through experimentation, through mistakes, through racing, through design, through crazy ideas that initially seemed impossible, and through people willing to ask ridiculous questions. Could the Corvette have a roof? Could it carry 5 people? Could it beat Ferrari? Could it look Italian? Could it become a 4-door? Could it handle a giant V12? The answer to most of those questions was technically yes. The harder question was whether Chevrolet should actually build them. History gave us the answer. The Corvette stayed a 2-seat American sports car. But those experiments made the surviving formula more interesting. Because every time you see a classic Corvette, you're seeing the version that survived. Behind it are dozens of possible futures that never happened. And 8 of those futures are especially fascinating. The Corv, the Impala concept, the SR2, the XP700, the Rondine, the ZR2, the Corvette America, and the insane ZR12. 8 machines that weren't simply unusual moments in Corvette history. They were roads Chevrolet could have taken. Roads that might have changed the Corvette forever. And that may be the most fascinating question of all. Not which Corvette was fastest. Not which one was rarest. Not even which one looked the best. But which one came closest to changing what Corvette actually meant. The Corv challenged the body shape. The Impala concept challenged the two-seat formula. The SR2 challenged Corvette's relationship with racing. The XP700 challenged what a cockpit could be. The Rondine challenged what American sports car design could look like. The ZR2 challenged how extreme a factory Corvette could become. The Corvette America challenged the idea that sports cars needed to sacrifice practicality. And the ZR12 challenged the limits of Corvette's engine bay itself. Together, they reveal something surprisingly simple. Corvette survived because it was willing to change, but it also survived because it knew what not to become. The 4-door never replaced the 2-seater. The V12 never became the standard Corvette engine, and the futuristic concepts never completely erased Corvette's familiar silhouette. Maybe that balance is exactly what made Corvette endure. Experiment enough to evolve, but not so much that the identity disappears. That's why these forgotten cars deserve another look. They aren't just strange footnotes. They're evidence of decisions that could have rewritten automotive history. And everyone asks the same basic question. Single Corvette at a dark crossroads, multiple illuminated roads ahead, cinematic suspense. What if Chevrolet had chosen differently just once? What if one of these experiments had reached dealerships? What if the Corvette America had become a real family performance car? What if Rondine-inspired styling had shaped an entire generation? What if the ZR12 had started a Corvette V12 era? We'd probably talk about Corvette very differently today. But history chose another road. And maybe that's why the forgotten roads are so interesting. They show us not what Corvette became, but what it could have become. Because the Corvette story isn't only the history of cars Chevrolet built. It's also the history of cars Chevrolet almost built. And those might be the most interesting Corvettes of all.